Hello, everyone. I'm honored to be invited to give this talk, and I'm excited to share with you some of my recent research. So the research that we've been doing lately has focused on a future where we have cognitive data about ourselves, which we can track kind of every day like we currently do with our physical exercise. So this is why we're calling it brain data as cognitive personal informatics, where personal informatics more broadly is the study of the data we keep about ourselves and the way we change our behaviors because of it. So this will be cognitive personal informatics. This is work I've been doing with my team here in Nottingham. And so it's been a range of people here, including some other assistant professors on our team, some research fellows and some PhD students. And so I could not be doing all of this research without their amazing help. So this is a big thank you to my own team as part of this work. Really, we're driven by the idea that this sort of consumer neurotechnology is arriving. It's something we can now buy for like $200 or whichever currency we want to use that measurement in. And then just, buy these, put them on ourselves at home and measure things about ourselves or try and use them to meditate. So the Muse, for example, which is the second image there, is designed to help us see if we can meditate while we listen to music. And the app will tell us using EEG data whether we are meditating effectively. The Neurosity crown, which is the third picture there, for example, you're supposed to wear while you are working, and it will tell you whether you are focused or not and help you try and be more focused. We would say, though, that we're not just interested in kind of technology that we're wearing on our head. We are also interested in the kind of other wearable technology that we can have now, which is starting to tell us a bit about our cognitive activity. So some smartwatches will tell us to meditate and take a break, and then measure your heart rate, for example, while you're doing it. And this is telling you a bit about how relaxed you are, which is kind of a cognitive activity. And this image at the bottom, the Spire stone, was designed to measure your breathing rate and would give you an alert if you were stressed. So it would say, bing, bing, you're stressed right now. You might want to take a break. Some of these work okay, some of them are a bit weird. So the stress alert from the stone, for example, would be, every minute you are stressed right now. And I would think, well, that's good because I have 1 hour of work to do and I need to finish it before the end of the day. And so I should be in a good sort of mentally stressed point in order to achieve that work for the next hour. I'm certainly not going to take a break to stop doing that work. So how you design these things is a little bit unclear for our future. So what we would say is this neurotechnology is either saying that you are stressed right now, or, shall we sit together and do some meditation to try and be relaxed? And they aren't really sort of helping us track our whole day. They're more like, let's do something now, or let's tell you what you are right now. So we are also looking a bit beyond current technology to a time when the technology can track, 24 hours a day for as long as we wear our smartwatch. And it will keep us track on this data for weeks and months and years. The other thing at the moment is that these are sort of not very accurate. So we're imagining we need to convey our level of confidence somehow in the way we design apps. The other thing that's a bit scary, and I've used DALL-E Mini, for those of you who know what DALL-E is, this is computer-generated images, to imagine a future where we have brain scanners at work helping us do our jobs. And we are studying people who are doing work in factories now where the work is less physical, it's less manual, and it's more to do with supervision of things. So work is becoming more cognitive. And there are examples of companies now which are putting EEG devices or brain scanning technologies inside things like helmets to help people understand when they should take a break. So this is also an interesting area that we are concerned about, maybe ethically, but also interested in how it will turn into good working practice in the future. We also know that people really want to do this. Like there's all sorts of companies that are popping up to say, track your mental health. It's often linked to mental health, even though technology can't really measure mental health. It can measure a state that we're in, which might be a cognitive state or a physical state, but it can't really measure mental health. But this mental health background is driving a lot of people to be interested in doing this. And what's really interesting is to see some apps now starting to try and do it. So this is two apps here. One is Weltery on the top and Garmin on the side. Weltery takes all sorts of data and then tries to say that you're currently quite stressed based on heart rate variability, and then gives you that sort of feedback, lots of times throughout the week. And then the Garmin one actually has a stress display, which is interesting, and it's saying how much of your day is low, medium, and high stress, or whether you're rest. And you can see that graph at the bottom where there's lots of orange. This is showing that someone has been stressed quite a lot throughout the day at different levels. So for us, this is very interesting. This is apps beginning to try and give you personal informatics about your stress levels, but there's a lot of confusion as to what is stress and what these things actually measure. So that's a good place to start. What is stress exactly? And we would argue that there are three types of stress that are regularly being confused in research. One is that stress is a mental health condition, that is like a chronic long-term condition. And that is not something that we think that wearable technology can measure, but something that lots of people are concerned about. There is feeling stressed about things. This is feeling anxious, which might be an emotional response to a situation and may be detectable, but may not be. It's kind of your response to a situation. Then the third one, which we can measure with physiological data, is whether the body is under stress, under duress. And so that is when you do exercise and your heart rate goes up, that is your body under some stress. But that stress can be triggered by your cognitive state as well. So that's when people say they can measure stress changes using physiological data, it is that third one that they can detect. And so I think I've got a line here. And this is what people want to track at the top, things like their mental health, but actually what you can measure is this thing at the bottom, and they're not exactly related. Stress as a mental health thing at the top is typically considered bad, but actually stress at the bottom level, physiological stress, can actually be quite good. You need to go into physiological stress to achieve a high level of exercise. And so in order to achieve a goal and do well at a job, either physically or mentally, you often need to put the body into stress, a good level of stress, in order to achieve it. So that difference is very important for the way we understand what's happening, but also for what we say is possible for the future of technology. We know people are motivated by managing stress levels, feeling about stress and mental health, and that's why they want to measure things about themselves. But what we can actually measure is whether your body is currently under stress, which can be good or bad. So we would say good stress is probably also what a lot of people refer to as high mental workloads. And mental workload is a well-known term, which many people try and study. And it's probably what the Garmin is measuring. It's a thing that lots of people say they thrive upon. They thrive under good high pressure in order to achieve their work goals. And they may feel good about that. They may feel bad about it, they may feel good about it, but lots of people enjoy having lots of deadlines and lots of pressures to make them work more effectively. You need high mental workload or high stress to achieve a hard task, and that will give you a good sense of achievement if you do it. Things like gaming, which lots of people enjoy and make them feel relaxed afterwards, also typically involves lots of cognitive stress or high mental workload in order to achieve it. So we know there's lots of these good examples where it's good to have these high mental workloads and you feel happy having had them. We would probably argue that, and there's many papers out there that say we can measure stress, or we can measure mental workload, or we can measure something else using physiological data. There is a high chance that these things that those measures are measuring are actually all the same sort of thing. Stress or mental workload or attention levels are all kind of your brain being highly engaged to some extent. So in our work, we typically use the word mental workload for all the papers that we write. Mental workload is kind of a little bit more agnostic, as in it doesn't matter if it's good or bad, whereas saying stress, people immediately think high stress is bad because we believe stress is bad at a kind of more fundamental level. But because high mental workload is a good thing to achieve a hard task, we like to use that word because it's a little bit less assumed that it's bad, if that makes sense. Mental workload as a theoretical basis has a lot of scientific work behind it. Work from Wickens, describing multiple resource theory, levels of attention, and also the NASA TLX measurement, the task load index, that is based on the kind of mental workload theoretical basis underneath. So everything we try and measure with NASA TLX is all kind of grounded by mental workload as a theory. And we also consider that mental workload is a good parallel for physical workload. So mental activity as a parallel for physical activity. And we think that makes it nice for considering how we will design apps for our future. So then we say to ourselves, what are the human-computer interaction questions in all this area? Because there are lots of papers that try and classify a state like high mental workload or low mental workload, or high stress or low stress based on data. And this is really a machine learning problem now. In the future, engineers and machine learning people will get better and better at classifying changes in our cognitive activity. And that's not something that HCI designers can necessarily contribute to unless they're machine learning HCI people. It's more a kind of thing that more experience will just get better at, the way that our watches are getting better and better at tracking different types of physical activity. This is now a kind of an engineering machine learning problem rather than a design problem. So we would say the interesting research questions for human-computer interaction are all to do with cognitive personal informatics. And so the questions there are, what amount of mental workload are people aiming for? Like, what are their goals? Do they want to increase their mental workload? We find that people, when they're older and maybe retired, are trying to do things to increase their mental workload. Lots of people who are too busy at work are trying to reduce their mental workload. And so there's lots of different interesting goals there that we don't really understand yet. We don't know what neurotechnology should help us to aim for longitudinally, like how will it track us over time? What things will it tell us? When we look back at our data for a year, what will that data say? We don't know exactly how to visualize this to people, because we want to say you are a high mental workload or low mental workload. We also want to say this is good and bad, and which one is which isn't necessarily the same. So it's not the same as physical activity, where more physical activity is nearly always better. We often want to reduce mental workload or achieve high mental workload at different times. And we're also not quite sure how society will accept this information. So there's some interesting society and ethics questions there about whether people feel it is okay to be tracked with their mental workload, or whether they want to track themselves, whether that will be okay and normal, or whether it will become something that society doesn't like to do. These are very interesting future questions for human-computer interaction. So one paper I quickly want to tell you about, which is one of our recent papers that was presented at CHI 2022 last year, I guess earlier this year, and that is our lived experiences of mental workload in everyday life. And this was us really beginning to investigate people as they understand their whole day about mental workload, they understand their whole week or year, what's that really like for people, in order to inspire future design and to guide future research into measuring mental workload. We had 3 research questions, and these are typically to do with how people understand mental workload or understand themselves, how they understand that mental workload has affected their life, has it improved their work, or if they have lots of difficult work, does that affect other parts of their lives? And also what goals they have for themselves, like do they try and take breaks, or do they try and optimize their time at work, just to understand what current goals they have. What we did is a longitudinal qualitative study, where we had 20 participants, but in the end 19 made it all the way through the study. And we asked them to track data about themselves with pen and pencil for a week long, just to make notes about themselves. We also gave them an app which would ping them for some judgments. It would say, how are you feeling right now? And then we'd ask them to do that several times a day. So this what took a longitudinal amount of time, was for a whole week we asked people to track themselves and what their mental workload levels were. The next week we then did a 1 or 2 hour interview with each person, and this was in order to talk to them about their data. So we showed them all the ratings they gave in that week before, and talked about it in the interview. And then as a research analysis, we did interpretive phenomenological analysis, which is a form of qualitative analysis, a bit like the well-known methods from Braun and Clark, but focuses a little bit more about people's experiences of technology as a method. And I'd recommend reading more about that if that method is new to you. So this was the app. So every 30 minutes, this was a custom-built app. every 30 minutes during work, it would ping them and say, what's your current mental workload level like? Or what's it been since the last time you gave a rating? And then in the evenings, it would happen once every hour. And then they could tell the app to stop for the night. And then it would stop until they next wake up, and it would ping them the next morning. And then we made a graph for each person, a bit like the one you can see, which showed them their ratings, which these ratings were based on the ISA self-rating measurement, which is out of 5. So that's why that graph is out of 5. We also asked them to fill in some diary information about their sleep and their mood, which was just added context when we talked to them in their interviews. During that 1 or 2 hour interview, which was on Zoom because it was during COVID, we talked to them about a few things. We asked them about their personal experiences that week. We asked them about how they understood and how they conceptualized mental workload. Like, did they imagine it to look a certain way, or did they have any design metaphors for it, basically, which we're still analyzing. We asked them what they wanted to know about their own cognitive activity. And we also discussed some ethical, legal, moral concerns about the future of this sort of technology. So that's what we covered in that 2 hours. The people that took part were office workers, people doing sort of everyday jobs in front of a computer, people who had Android phones, because that was our custom app was made on Android, and people who didn't have a clinical mental health history. And that was because we didn't want anything that we did to affect the way people thought about themselves if they had an existing mental health condition. Originally, we had 10 researchers and 10 people from industry, but one of the researchers was excluded after a while because they didn't participate in the study effectively. We paid people £75 for taking part, and then if they gave us good data throughout the week, lots of data every day, we gave them an extra £25 as a bonus for doing a good job. And in the end, everybody did a good job, so we gave them all £100 so that it was even for everybody. So these are the results. And actually, there's going to be results from 2 papers. One was that CHI paper, and the other one is results that we put into a recent Fairness and Accountability and Trust conference, the FACT conference. And that was the neuroethics side, which had an additional 3 themes. So the first 4 themes from our CHI paper. There was 2 themes at the top, which help us just understand a little bit about how people understood mental workload. And then I think our most important theme, the third theme, was the mental workload cycle. And this was a model that we generated from the qualitative data we analyzed, which helped us understand the kind of way people manage mental workload throughout a day. And then the 4th theme was about when that cycle couldn't be managed and what happened when that cycle went wrong. So in terms of general perceptions, people had positive and negative perceptions about high mental workload and about low mental workload. So they had good things to say about high workloads, like fulfillment, and they enjoyed doing high mental workload tasks, and they felt stimulated by it, like it was a good thing to do. But there were also some negative sides, like feeling stressed, feeling pressured or overwhelmed. For low, people were happy to be relaxed if they were doing low mental workload tasks, like kind of watching TV or eating and chatting to a friend. And they found that very easy and manageable. But there were some things that after a while they would feel bored or distracted or unproductive. And this was negative feelings of being in a low mental workload position. In medium mental workload, people often found that this was a good, sustainable level of mental workload. They could do lots of work this way. It was kind of like the best of both worlds, but they couldn't necessarily do hard tasks. And so there's some things they couldn't achieve in medium, but medium only really had positive comments in our interviews. There wasn't ever any particular negative comments about medium mental workload, apart from not being in other states. What was interesting then is to look at things that changed their perceptions of these. So people enjoyed being in a high mental workload state as long as they got a good outcome at the end. If they had a bad outcome at the end, then they did not enjoy being in a high mental workload state only to get a bad outcome. The amount of pressure involved in being in a high mental workload was also analyzed. So some people said that it was good to be in a high mental workload, but if they felt lots of pressure for a deadline, then that would start to affect it negatively. In terms of location, some people thought it was good to be high mental workload at work, but then they felt bad if they were low mental workload at work. But they felt good if it was low mental workload at home. So sometimes location could be a factor if they were allowed to be in that state wherever they were. And then finally, enjoyment was another example where people felt that they were some tasks which had high mental workload, but were also inherently fun to do. Like they had lots of fun doing gaming, for example. But high mental workload tasks at work were sometimes not fun. And so that affected the feeling about it. So then we talked to people about how they kind of changed between different levels and what caused them to change and why. And this is where we bring in our mental workload cycle. We found people described good changes from all different states to each other. So in particularly, people went from low to medium to high at different stages, or from medium to high and medium to low. What was interesting is that people said if they had been at high for a while, they typically sought to go straight down to low afterwards, rather than going down to medium. So in order to kind of counterbalance being in high for a while, they wanted to then be in low for a while to recover. But going to medium wasn't necessarily the best desirable outcome. We then talked to the things that meant that they felt bad. And it turned out that actually it was being stuck in a level that was really bad. And here we did start to see some negative outcomes of medium mental workload as well, but they were less severe. So if a person was ever stuck in high mental workload for a long time, so there was one person who had a big deadline on one of the days, and they had to work at high mental workload all the way from breakfast until the deadline without taking a break. And so being stuck at high mental workload all day led to feelings of burnout, fatigue, and resentment, and reduced work quality. So quality of work went down. And they were worried afterwards that this would lead to poor mental and physical health being bad outcomes. Some people in our study were stuck at low mental workload. And this was partly because of COVID, where people couldn't go to their work. So they were sent home. Well, they had to stay at home because of lockdowns. And being at home, they felt they were bored, unproductive, and not happy. And they wanted to do something, but they couldn't think of anything high mental workload to do at home because they were stuck at home. So being stuck in low mental workload, not having anything to do, also led to negative feelings. In terms of being stuck at medium, there were some people who had lots of fairly important but boring tasks to do that weren't very difficult. They just had lots of work to do, so lots of maybe mundane work. And this led to reduced excitement if they were stuck there for a long time without being able to switch to a low for a break. So this mental workload cycle is one of the main contributions from this paper, and one that we are now studying more in detail with our follow-up research to see if we can provide more data about it and quantify it more. So what was nice in some of the work was to see the purposes that people felt from these high levels. And that really validated some of the data that we had. And that is that high mental workload really had a purpose, and that was to achieve hard work, to get achievement, and to get high quality in their work. So knowing that they had those things and could use high mental workload and get those benefits was something they felt good about. Medium, giving them high productivity and also not too much concern, was a purpose that medium mental workload has. And low mental workload has this purpose for recovery, and it has this purpose for reward as well. So knowing that those things have purpose and they are all good is really important for the future of this type of research, because typically people say, let's see if we can make mental workload lower, but actually there can be good mental workload that is high, and that and having that in an app as a goal is something that we need to consider when we think about this in the future. So then our fourth theme was when people couldn't get into the cycle, like what was affecting their ability to have that natural cycle that made them feel good or healthy. And there was three here. This was life factors, internal factors that they had about themselves, and then external circumstances that changed things. So life factors were things like medical situations that happened. So one person was ill part of the way through the study, and that illness, which was a medical illness, meant that they were unable to reach high levels of mental workload during their work, and this was affecting their ability to do those things. So there were these kind of temporary interrupting factors that would affect people from being able to change their cycle. Internal things were kind of like thoughts, how they felt about something, how much effort they put in. And so if they felt like something was a waste of time, or affected their, judgments of what they were doing, then sometimes if they were in a negative state, then they wouldn't be able to motivate themselves to go and do a high mental workload task. So that internal limiting factor would stop them from engaging properly in the cycle. Then external was things like circumstances, things like having that deadline, meaning they had to stay at high mental workload all the way through, means that was a preventative factor for managing your cycle. And you can read in our paper from CHI 2022 a bit more about each of these factors. There were 3 themes that we got on the ethics side, and I'll tell you quickly about these because they're quite interesting for how people feel about mental workload in the future. So the first one of these is fear of the data, and this had quite a range of different types of fear that people felt. So in particular, they felt worried about personal judgment, like with this data, if someone else saw it, if someone at work saw it, mean that a boss might think that they are lazy, or mean like a boss would think maybe that they couldn't do a job or they should not be employed. So that fear of being judged by someone at work for your mental workload data was a concern. Also, the fear about people, what they would say about themselves, like if they saw data about themselves, would they judge it incorrectly and negatively? Would it lead them to have bad assumptions about themselves? This led on to a fear of consequences, and this was a mixture of what would happen if your employer or your boss thought that you were not working very well. Would you be fired? Would it be used for bad things at work? Would they use it to give you less money? That type of thing. And this also could be to do with exploitation. Would they be used in a company for a bad purpose if they knew that they could do certain tasks well? So the exploitation of this data, or the consequence you get at work as a knock-on effect, was something people were very worried about. And then the third part of it was the fear of the inaccurate judgment from the data. So part of that is the validity. So we all know that it's not very accurate data, but if a company is using that data to make decisions, then how do they handle that it might be inaccurate? And similarly, if you're looking at your own data about yourself on an app, what does that tell you, if that's inaccurate and you trust it? Is that a bad thing for you? And part of that is the misinterpretation, because there's lots of different things that might affect mental workload. So if you are good at your job, it might be that your mental workload level goes down because you can do a job more easily, and that's a good thing. But if people think that low mental workload means that you're not trying, then that could be misinterpreted as bad. So this is quite a complex issue, and we don't really know whether data should be low or should be high for different situations. People worried about the negative effect this sort of thing has on themselves. So people were worried that they would start to be overly concerned about the data, and they would try and change their behaviors to reach certain levels when maybe those levels aren't good levels to be at, especially if they're inaccurate. So some people feel sort of controlled about their habits when they start measuring themselves. And this is a well-known factor in personal informatics. And they said this could be particularly bad for cognitive personal informatics. And an example of that is when apps tell you something and then that creates that feeling inside you. So if the app says you are stressed, then people start to go, oh, yes, maybe I am stressed. Maybe that causes them to think about the things that they are stressed about, which creates a cycle of feeling more stressed. And so if this data is going to have a negative effect on people by telling them their state, then that should be studied quite carefully. And then we also talked to them about sharing, how they felt about sharing the data. And it was very interesting to see that people varied quite a lot about this. Some people had a very strong reaction to cognitive data being shared with employers or with third parties. So they're saying this is not acceptable to share such internal thoughts as a type of data for someone else. Whereas some of our participants were on the other end of the opinion, and they were quite relaxed about it. They said, if it helps people analyze something, then why not? This is quite an interesting data to look at. We should all know more about our brains so we can help our health. And then there was obviously in between. Some people said, well, it depends how risky it is to share the data, who it's being shared with and why. And some people were happy to share the data if it helped them to understand a job properly so that the job would get better. So if everyone could share the data to say that one task was too hard for everybody, then maybe the company could improve that task such that it's easier for everybody to achieve. And so that data could be useful if it helped make their life better. So there's a mixture of opinions there. So I just want to cover some quick discussion points, just because they're quite interesting. And this is from both papers, my main lessons that I took away. So for our future, I think one really important thing is that this data and the goals for it are very different to physical activity. So whatever your watch is telling you about physical activity, like, yay, you did 10,000 steps, and yes, you did lots of good exercise, you don't necessarily need the same thing in your mental workload. And so understanding what the goals are, and that there's good and bad versions of everything, this is something that's going to make the design for mental or cognitive personal informatics much more complicated. We realized that the ideal mental workload cycle could vary quite a lot. And so there were some people who wanted to optimize their work more. There were some people who wanted to take more breaks. There were some people who wanted to not be bored. And so this kind of ideal cycle varied quite a lot. And so it could be quite hard to decide if that ideal situation has been reached. And then there was, and then we were quite interested in knowing what will that kind of key motto become in the future. So there's a current kind of thing where doing 10,000 steps every day will keep you healthy, or doing 30 minutes of exercise every day will keep you healthy. What we don't know is what the kind of example in mental workload will be. Like, what is the cognitive step conceptually that we could say, if you do this much cognitive activity in a day, that will be good. In the future, we'll need these kind of basic, simple rules that people will share or change their behavior by. One really important thing for the future will be to remove this high mental workload is bad, therefore we should color it in red in the West, which I'd say in the West with traffic-like colors, then red is typically bad, yellow is typically not very good, and then green is good, which for a start has lots of different cultural changes in different countries. But in general, high mental workload is not bad, and so we should not give it a bad color. High mental workload can be good. So the thing we need to show that is bad is spending too much time at the same level for too long. So that's a different type of thing we need to change. And at the moment, most visualizations and most papers keep saying high mental workload is bad, but we've discovered that it's not. So that design issue is one of the biggest ones for us to overcome. There's also in this area a really large gap between good mental health and what we can actually measure. So that difference is kind of like saying, what's the difference between a healthy person and doing 10,000 steps? People want to measure and control their stress, but actually we can't do that. The things we can measure, we won't necessarily mean that we are not stressed when we measure them. So that gap between what people are motivated by, reducing stress, is a long way away from what we can actually measure. And that's going to be a difficult thing for us to manage. That gap isn't closed yet. Altogether, what I think is important is that we focus on this cognitive personal informatics future. And so I would invite you all to, if you're excited by this research area and doing research that's related, join our community, because we're focusing a new community on looking at cognitive personal informatics. For me, I've been trying to visualize where cognitive personal informatics is in relation to physical personal informatics, because physical personal informatics is really well established, and that's the green line on this view. So we are at the point where we study quantified self, and we study personal informatics, and we study habit behavior, and that's all happened in the last 5-10 years for physical activity. But in cognitive activity, we're back at a time where we are seeing, can we measure stuff in a lab? And we're starting to see if we can measure it in the real world, but maybe not. And we can't really differentiate between different types of cognitive activity at all yet. So right now, if the orange line, we got to detecting mental workloads in the lab quite happily around 2020. But current research is trying to do it in the real world. And then the future, 2030 and 2040, is understanding the personal cognitive informatics. And so this is what we talked about in our discussion at CHI 2022. Oh, I'll just quickly zoom past this view. So we have some community aims. We want to understand how big is this community, how many people are interested in this type of topic. And so if you are interested in it too, we'd love to talk to you more about it. We want to understand what everyone's research questions are, because I have my view, but I think there are others. We want to set a research agenda and have future workshops in order to discuss this more as a community. So things we're planning, we've proposed a workshop at CHI 2023. We're going to produce a special issue in a journal in order to look at this topic. And we're also going to start a series of talks about this topic and blog posts from different people and their perspectives. And if you want to be involved in any of that, I highly recommend joining our Slack community, where you can look at the type of things that we are discussing as a group. And there's about sort of 27 people in there at the moment. And we'd love to have more people in there so we can share with you information about our workshop. And since I'm not there in person right now, I'd love to talk to you more and answer any questions in that Slack. So please feel free to contact me through Slack, and we can have some exciting discussions about mental workloads and a future of cognitive personal informatics. So with that, thank you very much for having me in this talk, and I look forward to speaking to some of you in the future.